I can't say whether a helmet saved my life, but what I can say is that as mere flesh and bone, even armed with a bicycle, choosing to attack not one but two cars, I could have come off worse. I have a hand-sized metal plate where my right eye socket and cheek used to be. My right ear was severed, then reattached. I could have come off worse without one, without a helmet. But rarely a year goes by without some bicycle activist group complaining not only that mandatory helmet-wearing laws positively discourage bicycle commuting, bicycle use, but also that helmets do more harm than good. And during the collision sports season, rarely a week goes by without my getting a call from a parent asking which helmet's best at preventing sports concussion. So I thought an hour's examination of the state of the science on helmets, their myriad uses, their efficacy, would be a public service.
Here we go. This is my talk. I'm going to talk about what Nick was talking about earlier, which is about bike helmets. I was asked a few years ago to give a talk at a trauma conference about whether or not bicycle helmets work, and this is what I started off with, to talk about what conversations are like around bike helmets. And it's usually, people ask me, do bike helmets make a difference? And I'll say something like, obviously, and some people say, well, in a crash, how do you know you wouldn't have been saved anyway if you didn't have the helmet on and things like that? And I say, well, physics, because, conservation of energy is a thing. But some people say, well, but I can't do this experiment again. It's not repeatable because, I've already had a crash. I had a crash a certain way, and we can't reproduce that. Well, arguments around bike helmets tend to be, well, if you answer one question, people just try to come up with something else. And it just goes on and on and on again in some infinite loop. And so my position lately on this topic is usually I just don't engage anymore because I don't want to be part of that infinite loop. But most people worldwide tend to think bicycle helmets do work. And there's a lot of evidence around that. Like I think in Denmark, which is one of the main capitals of cycling, I think like 70% of the population thinks they should have a bike helmet law, for example. Even quite a large percentage in the UK, these are places where they don't have bike helmet laws. To give you some evidence about why I think that's true, well, this is an article on the satirical website The Onion, which is taking in some ways a piss at that, right? Like it's saying that bike helmets are so obvious that they work that this is how they suggest we should celebrate Head Injury Month, was to cyclists not to wear them, right? So there's definitely in the general population a belief that that's a good thing, but there's this element that don't. Besides this, I'm mostly going to just try to go through quickly some evidence around that. The first is this is what evidence there is from bicycle biomechanical studies. This is sort of roughly how bicycle helmets are meant to work. Down at the very bottom row there, that's the forces on the brain for not wearing a helmet. That's with wearing a sort of a standard helmet. And we've gotten, past few years, some newer helmet technology, which seems to be, at least in biomechanical studies, seem to work pretty well. There was another slide. Got lost. There was another slide in there. The Virginia Tech has come up with a way to rate bicycle helmets, and they go from 0 stars, which is a bare head, and 5 stars is the best helmet technology. Somehow it got taken out of my slides. But Virginia Tech, if you type in Virginia Tech bicycle helmets, it'll take you to that slide where they rate it. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis that I did with a couple of years ago now. Each red dot represents an effect from a study. Off to the left means that helmets are protective. Off to the right means they're not. The only kind of injury where it seems to be kind of not much of an effect at all is for neck injuries. Bicycle helmets are not designed to protect the neck, but every other kind of injury they seem to be protective, and very protective for serious head injuries, which what we use for ours is a skull fractures and intracranial hemorrhage as a proxy for serious head injury. We also did what I'd call like a cohort study analysis. A lot of studies on bicycle helmets come from case control studies, which some people argue are weak. A cohort study would be better. We did a cohort study-like analysis, and we found that the estimated effectiveness of helmets are about the same, whether it's a cohort kind of study or a case control study. The question then, because if bicycle helmets are effective, should we legislate them? Well, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that if you have a law, you'll increase bicycle helmet wearing, and there's a systematic review and meta-analysis that came out last year that looked at not just increases in helmet wearing, but does it have an effect on cycling head injury, and they found that serious head injury was reduced about 55% when there was a helmet law introduced, which is quite a large effect. This is some work that I haven't published yet, but I've been working on. This is data from Western Australia. These are serious head injury rates from the 1970s to roughly around today. When helmet promotion started in Western Australia, up to when they legislated, there was a really large reduction in serious head injuries in their hospitals. And it was about a reduction of nearly around 60% over that period. This is what it looks like for other kinds of injuries in Western Australia at that time. Neck injuries are almost non-existent. If we use those cyclists who present with no head, face, or neck injuries as kind of a control group, there is no sort of deviation from that trend over a 40-year period. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be much else happening around that time for cyclists except for their bike helmet law. This is what it looks like for fatalities, cycling fatalities in Australia. When laws came in beginning in July of 1990 in Victoria, and by July of 1992, there were all-age laws all across Australia, and the reduction was about a 46% reduction in fatalities, which is quite a large reduction of any kind in road safety in terms of fatalities. So it seems to be that things seem to be working like they're supposed to for places that have helmet laws, but then there's these arguments that, well, maybe cyclists will do riskier things, and this is what I mean by that. So there's this hypothesis called the risk compensation hypothesis, which is kind of around like if you put a helmet on, you'll do riskier things. If that's true, then there's this time ordering effect. So you have to be a cyclist who doesn't wear a helmet, and then you put it on, and then you cycle again, and then you'll do riskier things. So this is what I mean by that. So we got a cyclist doesn't wear a helmet, they put one on, and then they do something crazy. Now, I created this slide long before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, yeah, I should have Theresa May in there, sort of sandwiched between, I guess. But that's the idea. So we did a systematic review of that. I'll skip through the details of that. But here are the summary of all the different studies that we found. There were about 23 studies. There were 2 studies that were supportive, 3 that had mixed results, and a whole lot of studies that said there doesn't see an association between risky behavior and helmet use. And the blue suggests that those who choose to wear helmets tend to be safer kinds of cyclists. Okay, so if anything, it's in the other direction, not the direction people say it is. There's this argument that if you have a law, then there will be less cyclists on the road, and I won't go through that. We also did a review of that, and some basic results that we found from this. This is a study from surveys done in South Australia and Western Australia before and after their helmet laws, and the frequency of cycling before and after was roughly the same in both states. This is what it looks like for commuters, counts of commuters going into Adelaide, and the red dashed line there, that's when their law was, and it seems like before and after, they're basically the same. The little spike up that way is because they collected data for a longer period in that year, and the reduction in the later year, that was because I think they had the Adelaide Grand Prix or something like that, which made it harder for people to cycle. So the sort of 2 dots there that deviate a bit are easily explainable about what was going on in Adelaide at the time. This is what it looks like for a proportion of children cycling to school in Western Australia. There is a reduction in the proportion of kids cycling to school, but it seems to be part of an existing trend. So around 88 for those going to metro high schools was over 30%. And over time, they steadily declined, and there's no like extra sort of jump down from that when the helmet law came. So there's less cycling, but it's part of things that were existing before there was ever any helmet laws in Western Australia. This is just some other kinds of data that's available in Western Australia. There seems to be actually increases in the counts of commuter cyclists in Perth, I think, But there's reductions in police-reported crashes, which seems to be an existing trend, and there's some recreational cycling counts, which seems to have kind of declined, but when you pit that against the increase in commuter cyclists, it's kind of hard to get a sense about whether or not what's happening with cyclists generally in Western Australia, besides not a whole lot of anything overall. Okay, this is what the hospitalizations look like for those injured without a head, face, or neck injury. So those who wouldn't have had a crash where a head injury might have had some sort of input. There doesn't seem to be any sort of major decrease of any kind around the helmet walk cases. Because if there were less people cycling, you'd have less of those presentations as well, because it'd be what we epidemiology would consider to be less exposure. There's also the census data that exists that's collected as part of the census every 5 years. It's used quite a lot to say that this is the mode share for cycling in Australia, and it's a terrible measure for that. It's a terrible measure for that because it only measures something that's very, very specific on a very specific day. So the question actually reads, like in 2011, was how did you get to work on that day? And that's it. And it's a day that, and what people at north of the equator don't always understand is that that's our winter time, and maybe we had less cycling than that. There's also issues around, we have a very big landmass with very geographically small population centers. And so the idea that we have this overall measures across Australia is probably not a good idea. There's also some other technical issues in that the 1976 census wasn't actually a census. It was a census in terms of the counting of people, but it wasn't a census in terms of counting all the different questions that they asked in that year. It's buried in ABS reports, but it does exist there. So the idea that we can use the 1976 data is probably not a good idea either. Anyway, when we try to deal with some of those issues, this is what it looks like in New South Wales, sort of pre to post bike helmet law. In 1986, there were about 92,500 people cycling to work, and in 91 census, it went up 12,000 people, which isn't supposed to happen if you argue that bike helmet laws decrease cycling. And if you think about it as a percentage, the percentage of all people traveling to work also went up. So it doesn't seem like it had an effect around when bike helmet laws came into play, even though this data is often sort of misused anyway. Okay, this is what the Bureau of the infrastructure, I can't remember what the rest of the acronym stands for, but this is what their estimates look like for travel in Australian cities. Looks like the blue is cycling. So the cycling in Australia peaked in World War II. And since World War II, it's sort of made a steady decline and roughly leveled out around 1% since then, at least according to their estimates. There really is no big change at all in the early 1990s. Okay, so at least in Australia, and also we looked at what was happening in other countries, there doesn't seem to have been any sort of major reduction in cyclists when helmet laws have come into play. That includes also data from the US, from Spain, from Sweden, from Finland, and several other countries. Okay, so there's just a bit of a summary of what I have to say. Bicycle helmets do work. There's a lot of evidence that say they do. Legislation also does seem to work, including getting people to wear helmets and to reduce cycling head injury. The negative effects are often overblown, and often data is misused for that maybe shouldn't be used for that purpose. That's my talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Jake. Jennifer Makovic-Knight is completing a doctorate in clinical neuropsychology at Monash University on the subject of headgear for the prevention of brain injury in youth sport. Please welcome Jennifer.
Is this the... How do I work it? No, I'm confused. Have I gone backwards? How do we work this? Huh? Okay. Okay. Thanks so much for having me. So as Nick said, I'm a neuropsychology student, and my supervisors are Dr. Catherine Wilmot and Professor Biswadev Mitra. who are experts in sports concussion, and I also work with a team of other experts in concussion, from biomechanics to neurosurgeons. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Australian Football League, who fund my research, and also the Walter Cotman Equity Trustees. To get you all in the frame of mind as to why I do my research, I'd like you all to imagine that you have a child that wants to play collision sports. It could be soccer, rugby, or Australian football. Maybe you even play sports yourself, and you have seen headlines such as these in the recent media. And these headlines really suggest that there can be long-term brain damage and permanent consequences of playing these sports and sustaining concussion. So there's quite a bit of fear around playing sports these days, and particularly in recent times, with lots of community clubs actually starting to mandate headgear use because they're worried about concussion. So what is the evidence for this? Well, scientists continue to debate the incidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy and dementia-related symptoms that occur as a result of TBI and concussion. But what we do know for sure is that there are a lot of benefits to playing team sports and engaging in exercise. One of those is preventative against mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. There are physical health benefits in that there's lower risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease. It's great for brain development in children. And then finally, it brings about a sense of community among people, a sense of belonging, and also social connection. So the primary aim of our research is to ensure that people are able to continue participating in team sports, and also to ensure that those that sustain concussions are well taken care of post. So to give a brief definition of what concussion actually is, so you can sustain an impact to the head, neck, face, or anywhere on the body, and that force transmits to the brain and causes a shaking of the brain inside the skull. And this results in transient neurological symptoms. They can include physical signs such as headaches and loss of consciousness. There are also gait unsteadiness or difficulties walking in a straight line, behavioural changes such as irritability, cognitive impairment like memory problems and slowed reaction times, and then difficulties with our sleep-wake pattern. The other term used for concussion is mild traumatic brain injury, and in the literature the main sort of markers of these is that post-traumatic amnesia, which is a state marked by confusion and the inability to make new memories, is less than 24 hours, and that the Glasgow Coma Scale, which is a very common measure of consciousness following TBI, is between 13 and 15. In terms of recovery, the variability is large in terms of MTBI or concussion. So in my research, I've seen kids get concussed on the footy field that feel well or subjectively are symptom-free within sort of 10 minutes, some within a few hours, some not for weeks, and then some not for months. The guidelines do suggest currently that adults recover within 10 to 14 days, and children recover typically within 4 weeks. But like I said, there's a huge amount of variability, and the consensus is that a small percentage go on to have something known as post-concussion syndrome, and their symptoms can last for up to a number of years. So in talking about how do we prevent concussion, there's been lots of development in sports, from changing rules to implementing new training procedures and tackling procedures to prevent people getting concussions. But of course, headgear and helmets is also a primary intervention. Looking at the top picture here, we can see the hard shell helmet. This type of helmet is typically used in NFL football. And what we know about those helmets is that they are preventative against skull fractures, and they have also been reliably shown to prevent severe traumatic brain injuries. In terms of concussion, the research is a little bit variable still, but the consensus is really that a concussion can result not just from the blow to the head or the initial impact, but it's the movement of the head in response to that blow. And there's nothing really to stop the head from moving. So you can still very much sustain a concussion even with this type of headgear. And a lot of concern has sort of come up in the NFL about players using their heads as tackle weapons when they're wearing this kind of headgear, and therefore sustaining more concussions and more injuries in general. And as Jake mentioned just before, there's this idea of risk compensation, which is that people who put on headgear feel invincible. In sports, it's that they tackle harder, play more aggressively, and therefore sustain more injuries. A question that came to me in this research was that does this risk compensation idea, if it does exist in fact, would it differ in adults compared to children? The neurodevelopmental literature very reliably shows that kids have the parts of their brain responsible for making decisions about risk are less developed than adults, and they tend to be more risky in their behaviour in general. At present, there is a lack of clarity about the use of soft shell headgear, which is really the focus of my research, pictured below here on Caleb Daniel. At present, the recommendations by the AFL for soft shell headgear use are based on studies conducted mostly 10 or 20 years ago and mostly in rugby, before sort of the advent of all of the media attention around concussion, I suppose. So currently, clubs in the community either mandate headgear, they recommend it, or they ban it at their own discretion without any clear evidence-based guidelines on whether to use it or not. So as a bit of evidence, we've just done a survey study, and at least 30 clubs in this country have mandated the use of headgear. So that is children, mostly between under 10s and under 12s, have to, it's a no helmet, no play policy at those clubs, which is pretty interesting given that there aren't any sort of up-to-date evidence-based recommendations on that, which is where sort of my research comes in. So pictured here in the top we can see this sort of headband type of soft shell headgear. This one is typically used in soccer, and it's to prevent the impacts from soccer ball heading. And then the one below is the rugby scrum cap, which we also see used in AFL increasingly, with a few high-profile players choosing to wear it. And then also these community clubs, they're mandating this type in Victoria. And what I wanted to know was, do these actually prevent concussions? Is there a difference in the rate of concussion? Do they prevent superficial head injury? I mean, it would make sense that there's padding covering some parts of the head, so would there be less bruising, less lacerations or contusions to those parts of at least superficially covered by that material? And is there a risk of risk compensation? So are kids tackling with their heads or playing more aggressively when they're wearing headgear? Which leads me to a study which I've just recently conducted. It was a systematic review, so we gathered all of the literature on this topic. Oh, have I gone too far? I have. Oops. Oh, that's looking very weird. Anyway, so we looked at 3 outcomes, and what those outcomes were, we're looking at concussion, superficial head injury, and the rates of injuries to all body regions as a measure of risk compensation. We only found 8 studies that were applicable after screening over 4,000 and full text screening 72. And what we found was that no study had ever been conducted in youth Australian football. And this is very likely because in the past there weren't a lot of clubs actually mandating headgear, whereas now we're seeing a difference, so it might be more applicable to do in the future. There were 6 studies conducted in rugby and 2 in soccer. And males represented 83% of participants across these studies. So it was quite concerning that young female athletes have not really been included largely in the prevention literature. They actually accounted for only 17 participants in all of those 8 studies that we looked at. And of the 8, only 5 were actually exclusive to youth. And I wondered whether having adults and children all thrown together might dilute the impact of risk compensation behaviour, if in fact it does differ between adults and children. In terms of the outcomes, the rate of concussion in 5 of those studies was the same in groups. So when they compared the headgear wearers to the no headgear wearers, there was no difference in the rates of concussion. In 2 studies, they did show a difference in that concussion risk was lower. However, one of those was a survey study, so the evidence was not very robust. In terms of superficial head injury, surprising 3 of 4 also found no difference, even in the rates of bruising or lacerations to the head. And then finally, there were only 4 studies that actually investigated injuries to all body regions, and half of these found an increase in the risk of injury in headgear users, and that was by 16% and 23% increased risk in rugby players who were wearing headgear. So what does this all mean? Well, at the moment, based on our findings, what we'd report back to the AFL and community clubs that are involved in our research is that we can't actually support the recommendation of headgear currently. There are very few on-field studies. The laboratory studies also show that this type of currently commercially available headgear does not impact attenuate. And some protection across the literature in general and the adult literature, some protection may be offered against those superficial head injuries. However, these are mostly related to auricular hematoma, or what some of you may know as cauliflower ear. So the main sort of purpose for wearing headgear at the moment might really be for rugby players just preventing cauliflower ear. Beyond that, they're not really offering a whole lot. And without any quality evidence, we can't really determine whether headgear may also be contributing to some risk of harm if people are actually sustaining more injuries while they're wearing it. So in conclusion, our future goals are to provide the community with up-to-date information on the use of this equipment so they can make informed decisions about whether to mandate it or not mandate it. The quality of the evidence, though, I must say, is quite low, especially for this on-field research. There were only 2 randomised control trials in all of these studies that we assessed, and among youth female athletes, the literature is very scarce, so we don't know whether these hypotheses necessarily apply to that group. And at this point, we can't fully discount, at least in collision sports, the idea of risk compensation. However, given that the small amount of evidence we had showed that it was applicable in rugby players, but not soccer, it might be that because of the nature of tackling in sports like rugby and AFL, that there is this idea that they might be tackling with their head or tackling more aggressively, whereas injuries sustained in soccer or concussions sustained in soccer are more associated with repetitive balling of the head balling, whatever you call it, and their tackling is more tackling of the feet, and they sustain their injuries in falls as well. So it's just a different kind of mechanism. So our team is currently working to address this issue by conducting some research in AFL. Ideally, we wanted to look at headgear use in adults, but not enough adults wear headgear. However, at this youth level, we're seeing such huge mandates that we have actually done an injury surveillance study over the last 2 years. So we've followed 20 teams last year and this year. 10 of those teams mandate headgear and 10 do not. And we'll be looking at concussion rates, superficial head injury rates, and injuries to all body regions combined to see whether there's a difference in these 2 groups. And we've also aimed to get equal numbers of male and female players. So we've recruited lots of young female athletes in Melbourne, which has been great. We've also put a survey up on the AFL community website. And this survey is about headgear, what the community thinks about it. We've been surveying players, coaches, anyone involved in community football or football in general, and asking them what they know about headgear. And I'm sort of analysing this data at the moment, which will be very interesting, but the goal of that is to figure out what pockets of the community we need to translate this information to and how we best do that to make sure that in the future people are provided with the correct information and that we can keep kids who play sport as safe as possible. And that's it. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes for questions. My apologies for the feedback on the roving microphone. I'm not sure why that's happening, but if we can persist with that, and if I can ask you if you feel comfortable in so doing, saying who you are, where you're from, before you ask a question. Are there roving mics available? Where is... Someone got microphones, folks? Really? Are you kidding me?
You want to just talk without?
Yeah, if you could bring a mic down, that'd be great.
Sophie Skinner from the Judicial College.
Right.
You just mentioned at the beginning about the fact that we're also looking into caring for people who've suffered concussions, and I'd be interested to know a little bit more about current thinking on that.
Yeah, so I'll talk into the microphone. So my research group, the next sort of phase of the project, so what we're looking at firstly in the injury surveillance is management as well. So by way of just collecting that data and surveilling teams, we can see who's had concussions and then who's played the next week, when they should not have. Because the recommendation is that a child with a concussion should be removed from play and then not play the following week. We have seen in a number of cases that isn't happening. So that's a part of the research, is feeding back to the community that maybe the concussion management protocols at the club are not currently sufficient. And personally, I'd like to see a bit more follow-up, some continuity of care with trainers, checking in with those kids the following week, or even passing on to other trainers that this kid has had a concussion, and if he shows up to training, he's not actually supposed to be here, because that is quite difficult for all of the staff to keep track of when it's a very relaxed community environment. And then second to that, our research group is currently developing a rehabilitation treatment program, and what that includes is a CBT-based type of therapy for people with post-concussion syndrome, and it also includes modules of vestibular physiotherapy and normal physiotherapy, and it's a very holistic approach aimed at, but yeah, more or less it's based on psychological cognitive behavioural therapy.
G'day mate, my name is Stephen, excuse the voice, but this is what I got when I had my traumatic brain injury at 3. So I was hit by a golf club. Also too, another thing, I want someone to help out with the DSP this weekend because I'm suffering. But I just wanted to know, are you doing other sports as well as rugby league and as well as Aussie Rules, which are important sports, great to everybody? But to golf, I've been through horrendous times since I was a kid. My family tell me there was towels of blood in the bathroom, and one of the family members hit it. So they've lived with that all their life. But are you doing golf as well and other sports?
It's a very good question. My research is specific to AFL. Broadly, there are definitely other researchers looking into different sports where there is an incidence of TBI. Interestingly though, I'm glad you brought it up because I haven't seen a lot of studies in golf. I've seen a lot in hockey, lacrosse, equestrian, but that's one that I haven't actually looked at before. So I'll be interested to go home and have a bit of a look at the literature
if you want to come and have a chat to me, I've got hemiplegia, everything, but if anybody can help out with my DSP this weekend through Centrelink, I would love you if I could hear that before I go. But thank you very much. I'll chat to you later. Thank you.
Don't forget, you can also ask questions of both Raf and Jake as well. So, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I will ask one, which will frighten the daylights out of all of you. I think this lady here was next. Yeah, this lady.
Hi, my name's Michelle from the Department of Defence. I was just wondering, in all the research that you've been doing, has there been any talk of looking at the headgear and redesigning the headgear or
Oh
changing
yes,
the make
sorry,
of the
that was
headgear?
a very important point I forgot to mention. So a person who's on our team is Andrew McIntosh, who also works with these lovely gentlemen, and he is currently contracted by the AFL to develop manufacturing standards for headgear in AFL specifically. Basically, the standard at the moment is that if any one of you wanted to design a piece of headgear and go sell it at Rebel Sport, you could probably do that. There aren't any manufacturing standards on the use of this particular type of softshell headgear. In biomechanics in general, there are definitely engineers and researchers constantly working on improving helmet prototypes, for sure.
Gentleman over here.
Thank you. Leon O'Brien from the Office of the Public Advocate. For Jake, no question about helmets, because I had an accident, a bike accident 10 days ago, broke 4 ribs, destroyed a helmet. You haven't talked about the quality of helmets, any recommendations? And
I mentioned that Virginia Tech has been doing studies on helmet ratings. A couple of years ago now at an international cycling safety conference, there was a lot of discussions around trying to unify the different standards around the world and also to create a rating system. Because one of the having a standard is very useful for exactly reasons that were brought up. But a problem with standards is that the manufacturers only aim for the standard if that's all there is. Having a rating system is a way to prod them to make better helmets. And that's what Virginia Tech is doing. A group from Sweden is doing the same, and I think in the UK as well. Australia is not doing that right now, but there is a big focus on that now. So there's MIPS is a new helmet technology, and there's also WaveCell. I can't remember what manufacturers do what. They're different technologies, and at least the manufacturers claim that they are much more protective.
thank you. And could I ask Raphael, how do you balance your 30k speed limit recommendation with traffic management?
Okay, so we're recommending that for urban environments where children are playing in the streets, not the feeder roads, and also where there's a high pedestrian activity. And so it can be between 30 and 40. I mean, 40 was 13% is what we found on the average. But we shouldn't be going above 40. That's for sure. This 50 limit at the moment needs to come down. Europe has gone to 30. The best practice countries, Sweden, Netherlands, UK even. And you'll find that in Germany, for example, there are speed cameras everywhere, despite what people think, pulling the speeds right down in those areas, those urban areas where you can find children and cyclists. So it is well accepted in Europe. We've got to get on board with Europe. I think we have in front of schools. There are 40k limits in certain areas, in certain cities, certain towns, but I think we just need to have a blanket one now. I think we need to reduce that 50 down to 40.
Can you please thank Raph, Jake and Jennifer?
Thank you. That's good.